Less than 50 days away until toe meets leather, and it's preseason magazine season, which means it's time for us to talk to our good friend, one of the best in the business, Phil Steele, who just dropped his 30th edition of Phil Steele's College Football Preview magazine. Again, he joined the show. Phil, what's going on, my man? Appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, Chris, I am having fun. This is my fun time. I get to do 6 to 8 radio shows a day. I'm working maybe 50, 60 hours a week. It's like being on vacation. How about yourself? How are you doing?
I'm doing well, man. Like I said, less than 50 days. We're almost there. You can start to smell that fresh cut grass and smell that pigskin. And it feels like football time. I think talking season was what the HBC used to call it. But again, Phil, like I mentioned to you, man, 30th edition. Congratulations to you, your entire team, and the fantastic product. As folks watching this show can see, I've got the physical product right in front of me, holding it in my hand. Just give folks an idea of the work that goes into this, and especially, Phil, your job has gotten much more difficult over the last couple of years with the portal and, you know, the way rosters are changing. Just give folks an idea the work that goes into this, and again, congratulations on a 30th edition.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Chris. Yeah, it's actually a 7-month process to write this magazine, and there's just so much information. It's like getting 134 media guides rolled into one. You want to know anything about any team in the country, and I'm talking even smaller teams like maybe a Troy or a Jacksonville State. We give you 2 full pages on them. But I start the Sunday after Thanksgiving going through the teams that are not playing in bowls. I then read through every article that is written about that team for the entire season. It gives me a real good ebb and flow, not only of the team, but of each position. Then I do the first write-through process. Now, the transfer portal has changed things. So the second write-through process is once we get the spring roster, you've got your freshman signees, you've got your portal signees, you have to rewrite each position. And then the third write-through comes after I talk to the head coaches. And I talk to the head coaches post-spring. That way you really can capture what's going on with each of them. And this year I talked once again to over 120 of the 134 head coaches. Each call takes about an hour apiece. We go over every player on the team. They tell me where to rank each player as far as the positions, strengths, weaknesses, and then tell me how they feel about each position. Then I wrap it up, do the final third right through, and finally put the magazine to the press. But we used to be able to go to the press in May, Chris, and now with the portal closing April 30th, we went to the press June 7th, gave it the entire month of May, first week of June to capture where everybody signed. And pretty much anybody that's worth signing and going to contribute this year is signed and in the right place in the magazine.
Yeah, Phil, I know a lot of folks like myself were anxiously awaiting as we waited for July 4th this year. Like you mentioned, typically you could wait late May is when we were getting the preseason magazines, yours included. And you made us wait a little bit longer, but the most accurate, up-to-date information. Again, it was well worth the wait, Phil. Let's go ahead and dive into everything. I want to start with the debate of number one. That's been a big question, Phil. Who should be number one? Who is going to be number one going in the season? Is it Georgia? Is it Ohio State? That seems to be the big debate this offseason. You've got the Georgia Bulldogs at number one. Why were they the pick for you?
I think depth is one of the main reasons. Going over Georgia's team, their entire roster, you look at their third team, Chris, and a lot of these players would start for other teams. This is just a team that's extremely deep. And now we're in the playoff era, right? So in the playoff era, you not only play your 12 games during the regular season, they'll play in the SEC championship game, making it 13. Then Lord knows how many playoff games they're going to play as well. You need to have depth to stand up to that long of a season. And Georgia is the deepest team in the country. You can go 3-4 deep at every single position across the board. They've got a veteran quarterback in Carson Beck. They've got my number 1 rated offensive line in the country. Defensively, how about my number 7 defensive line, number 3 linebackers, number 3 defensive backs, and then they're a complete team. They also have my number 3 special teams. So overall depth, overall talent, I got Georgia number 1. Now, don't be surprised if they lose a game in the regular season. They're playing 3 top 10 teams on the road: Alabama, Texas, Ole Miss. That's pretty tough to do. But I still think when the season's over, they're in the SEC championship game, win the SEC title, and finish number 1 at the end of the year.
You mentioned the Alabama Crimson Tide, Phil. I want to jump there. Your thoughts, I'm sure you had conversations with Kalen DeBoer. Your thoughts on what a new era will bring to Tuscaloosa. It feels like a fool's errand to expect them to keep up the success that, Nick Saban had. I mean, when you look back at his tenure, it was just an incredible run there. But from talking to Coach DeBoer, things are obviously different, which can be a good thing. But as you know, Phil, folks fear change. What's the sense or the feeling you got from talking to Coach DeBoer? And obviously what Bama's going to be this year, which let's not forget, they still have one of the most talented rosters in the country.
Yeah, and, ironically, Chris, when Coach Saban stepped down and all of a sudden a bunch of players hit the portal, I was like, well, Alabama's in for a rebuilding year. I mean, how do you replace a legend, for crying out loud? But after going over the team with Coach DeBoer, here's what I gather from it. First of all, I think that this year's Alabama team, talent-wise, has more talent than the Washington team that he took to the national championship game last year. First, Kalen DeBoer's a heck of a head coach, 104 wins, 12 losses in his head coaching career. And while they lost all those key players to the portal, I was wondering, but then look what he brought in. He brought in a Damani Jackson from USC at the defensive back spot, Keon Saab from Michigan. He brings in the Lou Groza Award winner at kicker and Graham Nicholson. I think the offensive line's upgraded by bringing in Parker Brailsford at center. All those snap problems they had last year gone because Brailsford's one of the best. So all of a sudden he did solid replacements. He's got better talent, I think, this year than he even had at Washington. Jalen Milroe should have a fantastic season at QB, and Alabama's loaded in talent. So I think they're a legitimate SEC title contender. They have a top 10 offense and a top 10 defense this year. And when I go through their schedule, I've got them a pure underdog against Oklahoma, a 3-point dog. I've got the Georgia game, a toss-up that's at home. Other than that, I've got them favored in all their other games. So this is an Alabama team that I think is not going to take a step back this year. In fact, could even match last year's 12 wins.
Phil, one of my favorite things you do on a yearly basis, again, the way you crunch the numbers, you're able to identify your most improved teams, teams that you feel like are going to make the biggest jump from year to year. I know one of those teams in the SEC you did mention was South Carolina. You feel like they're going to be much better. Certainly there are others as well. Who are a couple of the SEC teams that you identified and the numbers tell you that they could and maybe should make a big jump in 2024?
Yeah, and to qualify for my most improved list, I changed this I think it was about 15 years ago. It used to be just the overall who's going to improve. Now I made it, hey, this is a team that had a losing season last year that I think is going to make a bowl game and be much improved. So you had to have a losing season last year. 3 SEC teams actually qualified. Florida, Auburn, and South Carolina are all on that list. So when I look at these teams, let me go to South Carolina. I know you got a warm spot in your heart there, Chris, for South Carolina. So let's start with them. Going over the team with Coach Beamer, first of all, the first thing I mentioned is, can you keep any offensive linemen healthy this year? Because last year their offensive line was ridiculously hit hard by injuries. They ended up starting 2 true freshmen that weren't even on the team until June last year. They ended up being the starters because they just lost so many offensive linemen to injuries. So they're going to have a vastly improved offensive line. They're going to have a different offense. I mean, their quarterbacks this year, Lenore Sill is 240 pounds, Robbie Ashford 236 pounds, both very mobile guys. I think they run the quarterback more. They bring in a Rocket Sanders at running back. And I also like Oscar Attaway, who impressed me with North Texas. So they've got 2 really good backs. Sanders was not 100%. He didn't even play in all the games for Arkansas last year. If he returns to his form of 2 years ago, look out. They're going to have, I think they double last year's rushing total at least. And then you look at the receiving core. You've got Nick Harbor, I think, will finally live up to that billing in his second year. You bring in Alarvadan coming in from Miami of Ohio, Jared Brown from Coastal Carolina. They have talent at the receiving core, and defensively, I think they'll be strong. Now, they're going to have to take care of business at home. They play LSU at home, Ole Miss at home, Texas A&M at home, Missouri at home. I consider all those games winnable. Those are all big-time teams, but South Carolina can indeed play with them. So I think we're going to see a South Carolina team with a much improved record this year, getting back to a bowl game.
So, Phil, as we take a look at the rest of the SEC, of course, the big storyline that'll be the talking point at SEC Media Days and as we get closer to the season, Texas and Oklahoma are officially members of the SEC. They will go through their first conference slate this year. Your thoughts on where those 2 programs stand as they enter the SEC, and how long do you think it's going to take for them to adjust?
Not long at all. In fact, I think both are there talent-wise. In fact, in the magazine, I list 2 different rankings. I have the Power Poll, which I take my 9 sets of power ratings, mold them all together, and say, here are the most talented teams in the country. And in that respect, Texas comes in number 4, and Oklahoma comes in number 7. I love the defense Oklahoma has with Brett Venables. It's finally going to be a Brett Venables defense with 8 starters back on that side of the ball. I like Jackson Arnold, the QB, and as long as the offensive line comes along, they're going to be in good shape. So I've got them number 7 overall. Now, in my actual rankings, I have Oklahoma number 20, and Texas I have at number 4. And you might be wondering, well, that's strange. But here's the reason. Schedule. When I look at the schedules, and on philsteele.com, I broke down the schedules of the SEC teams. Texas plays the second easiest schedule of any SEC team. The only big boys they play this year are Georgia and Oklahoma. They avoid Alabama, they avoid Ole Miss, they avoid LSU, they avoid Missouri. So you got to love the schedule. When you look at Oklahoma, they basically pull in all the big boys. They're playing Texas, Bama, Ole Miss, LSU, Missouri, and they only have 3 SEC home games this year. Texas only has 3 SEC road games because of their neutral site meeting Oklahoma gives up its home game this year. So Oklahoma has a vastly tougher schedule than does Texas. Now, let's hone in on Texas for a minute because I think they're the team that's going to have better success. Texas has got a solid offensive line and defensive line. They've got the best quarterback room in the country with Quinn Ewers, Arch Manning, and Trey Owens. I like the replacements they have at the skill positions. I think that even though they lose their top running back from last year, they lose their top 5 receivers. I like the replacements. And so they are a talented team. They've got a number 2 special teams. They've got that schedule. They get Georgia at home. You know, it wouldn't surprise me if we see Texas and Georgia play each other 3 times this year. Once in the regular season, once in the SEC title game, maybe once again in the playoff. We've never seen teams play each other 3 times.
Phil, another team that I think most feel at least is going to be in the college football playoff, Ole Miss at least has a great chance to do so. You've got them finishing 4th in the SEC, which again, I know, Phil, for all of us, this was very different, right? We're no longer picking SEC East and West. We're picking, 1 through 16. You've got Ole Miss at number 4. Just talk about the Rebels. Are you buying the hype on Ole Miss, Phil, with all the transfer portal pieces they added?
Yeah, and you talked about the changes in the magazine, Chris. Try predicting an 18-team conference like the Big Ten. I'd much rather have divisions to forecast than this 18 teams. You pick a team 11th and people are like, oh, my God, you're ahead of 8 teams for crying out loud. But I digress. Let me get off that subject and head over to Ole Miss. And when I look at Ole Miss, they've got talent. Look at the quarterback position with Jackson Dart, a very deep running back core. They've got a lot of guys that have been the top rushers for their team. Now, I wonder about the health of Logan Diggs, but they bring in, Rashad Amos from Miami of Ohio. They bring in Henry Parrish from Miami of Florida. They got Bentley. They've got a dynamic set of receivers. In fact, my number 4 receiving core in the country, top-notch offensive line, and the defense is going to be the best they've had under Kiffin. Biggest question mark I have, probably special teams. I only rate them number 65 coming in, but they have a very nice runway to the season. It should be like they had 2 years ago. Remember 2 years ago, I said they could start out the season 7-0. They did. Well, this year, they're probably going to be favored in the first 6 games. At South Carolina game's the question mark. Then they got to play at LSU, home to Oklahoma, home to Georgia, at Florida. Take care of business at home against Oklahoma and Georgia. It's a big year, but even if they lose, let's say 3 games, an SEC team with 3 losses is going to make the playoff. You're going to have 4 or 5 teams make the playoff from the SEC. So they should be able to make the playoff this year. And I think it's probably Lane Kiffin's best team he's put on the field.
Phil, speaking of college football playoff hopefuls, again, a couple of teams that you have tied for 5th, which, like you mentioned, when you're picking 1 through 16, there's going to be some ties in there. LSU, Mizzou, Oklahoma, and Tennessee all tied 5th. If there was one that came from that group that maybe let's just say, Phil, you feel best about of LSU, Mizzou, Oklahoma, Tennessee, which of those 4 would you most side with?
I would go with Oklahoma. Once again, they're number 7 in my power poll. The reason I've got them down there is they played a ridiculously tough schedule this year. They have to play LSU, Missouri, Ole Miss, Texas, Auburn, all away from home. And the home games, none of them are really easy. Alabama, Tennessee, South Carolina. That's just a brutal conference schedule. But I do like this defense. Brett Venables, talk to him at length every year. I love the way he's built this defense. The first year, he has a rather complex D. And the first year, they gave up 461 yards per game. They trimmed that to 390 last year. I think this year, they're one of the best defenses in the country. I've got them number 6. And then offensively, I think Jackson Arnold will look better. He had two crucial interceptions in the bowl game, which cost him. But as long as Bill Bedenbaugh is the offensive line coach, he should be able to form an offensive line. And I think Oklahoma might be the most talented of those four teams.
Phil, one of the rankings I was surprised to see was Auburn down at number 11. Talk about the Tigers. What are your thoughts on Hugh Freeze as he builds that program? And were you as surprised as maybe I and others were that they decided to stick with Peyton Thorne and didn't go get a quarterback in the portal?
Yeah, and I remember prior to the bowl game, he was pretty sold on Peyton Thorne, and then Thorne had an off bowl game, and all of a sudden he opened up the competition. But he does like Peyton Thorne. He does like Hank Brown. They do like Ernier, so they do like the talent they have. And Thorne should be better in his second year. I mean, he spent last spring with Michigan State, so it was a late move over. They've got the talent, and where Peyton Thorne is going to look the best this year is with the receiving corps. When I talked to Coach Freeze and went over the team with him, he's just flat out said their receivers last year were below average. And he, of course, brought in the Freeze 4 this year. Not only just the Freeze 4, it's 4 fantastic freshmen, but also Robert Lewis from Georgia State. He brought in Keandre Lambert-Smith from Penn State. Brought in Sam Jackson, a guy that was a quarterback at Cal, but I love his athletic talent. Now, all of a sudden, they may have the most improved position in college football, going from below average to one of the better receiving corps in the country. They've got a solid offensive line. And once again, we go back to how many damn teams there are in the SEC and where you're picking them. I'm picking the team 11th, but I got them on my most improved list. I think they make a bowl game. I'm pretty bullish on Auburn this year, but there are just so many good teams in the SEC. I don't know if you knew that, Chris.
Phil, I was going to ask 9 through 15, which is essentially the second row here of your selections of your forecast in the SEC. Which of those teams do you feel like this season could surprise most and make the biggest jump? And I know you talked about the most improved list. I look at a team like Texas A&M, who has high expectations. Year one of Mike Elko. You know, obviously Florida and Arkansas, you got a pair of head coaches on the hot seat. South Carolina, you talked about. You know, of that group, who would you buy most stock in and maybe surprise most and, jump to the first page, I guess you could call it, of the forecast of the leaderboard, if you will?
Yeah, I'm going to say the team that has that potential is Texas A&M. And I'm going to go back to the first year at Duke for Mike Elko. Go over the roster with Coach Elko, and I wasn't overwhelmed. And basically, I picked them last in the ACC, and they finished 9-4. So shocked the heck out of me. And I thought Elko leaving as the defensive coordinator from Texas A&M hurt that defense the last couple of years. You remember 2021 when he was there, they allowed 15.9 points per game, and they sort of took a regression the last 2 years. Now, Duke, again, surprised me last year, 8-5, and they probably would have been better had they not lost their starting quarterback. Now he steps back to Texas A&M. He knows a lot of these players. He was just here a couple of years ago. He's got a good quarterback in Connor Wegman. Keep him healthy. Look out. They've got a veteran offensive line. The O-line was a weakness last year, but he feels they firmed that up. He doesn't think they'll be the best offensive line in the SEC, but much improved. And he told me this, and this is a big line. They have a chance to be the best defense he has coached. And that's like, wow. He's had some pretty good defenses, Mike Elko has. So if that defense comes around, if Wegman stays healthy, if the offensive line does develop, I think they've got the talent. I mean, we know Jimbo Fisher brought in the recruits. And all 8 units rank in my top units in the front of the magazine, including special teams, which I rated number 2. So keep your eyes on Texas A&M. They are a threat.
Phil, I think one of the coolest things that you do with your magazine, like you just mentioned, is have conversations with all of these head coaches. Was there a conversation with a SEC head coach that, for whatever reason, stood out to you, Phil? Maybe you learned something you didn't know about the football team. Maybe you left the conversation feeling a little bit better about the prospects of the season. Like, was there a convo that you look back on that really jumped out to you from this year?
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about a coach that's on the hot seat this year, Billy Napier. And, I'll go back to last year's conversation with Coach Napier. And I'm honest with him. Coaches are honest with me. So the first when we went over quarterbacks, I'm like, Coach, Graham Mertz? I wasn't wild about Graham Mertz in Wisconsin. Why'd you bring him in? Couldn't you find a better quarterback than Graham Mertz? And Coach Napier's like, Phil, let me tell you this. And he broke down all the strengths of Graham Mertz and why he was going to be successful. All he did was lead the SEC in completion percentage with 73%, had 20 touchdowns, just 3 interceptions. Now this year they've got Mertz, but they also have DJ Lagway, who gives them a change of pace, running quarterback, and I think he's physically gifted. So now they're really loaded there. And remember, Dan Mullen wasn't a great recruiter. I think Billy Napier's brought in 3 really good recruiting classes. Third year is when coaches usually hit their stride. Remember Mike Norvell at Florida State, 2 losing seasons to open up. Everybody wanted him out. All of a sudden, look where Mike Norvell is now. And talking to Coach Napier, another thing I brought up this year wasn't the Graham Mertz, it was Coach. That's the number 1 toughest schedule in the country. And he's like, Phil, I think it's going to be more manageable than you think. And then he gave me the reasons why. So once again, they go with the Graham Mertz thing, go with the schedule. I think Florida's going to surprise some folks this year and have a better year than expected.
Phil Steele's college football preview. He's been doing it for 30 years now. One of the best in the business. Phil, let folks know where they can get the magazine, both online and in stores.
Hey, I appreciate that, Chris. Now, if you're out and about driving around, you want to pick up a copy today, it's 352 pages, 2 full pages on every single team. It's like getting 134 media guides rolled into one. And we give you the same amount of coverage on a team like Jacksonville State that we do on Alabama or Georgia. It's only available at Barnes & Noble and Books A Million. Those are the only 2 locations you can get it. So don't go Walmart, grocery stores, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million. But you can also go online and get it at philsteele.com. When you go to philsteele.com and buy the hard copy of the magazine, I'm going to charge you a shipping charge. It costs to mail things. However, I give you the digital magazine for free, and that's actually updated all the way through the start of the season. As an example, Utah State. You go to our digital magazine, head coach Nate Drelling, who took over for Blake Anderson in the last couple of weeks. So you can go to Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, or philsteele.com to get this year's magazine. But you're going to use it every single day of the football season.
Phil, as always, is one of my favorite conversations. It lets us all know that kickoff is close. And as always, my friend, I appreciate you taking the time.
Chris, I always enjoy our conversations. Appreciate you having me on, my friend. And I love this SEC Unfiltered. Let's let it roll.
We'll do it again soon, my man. I appreciate you.
Thank you.